Hello, everyone. Welcome to AALS's Faculty Focus. It's great to have everyone here today. I'm going to wait just a few more seconds to make sure that everyone has a virtual seat in the room, and then we'll get started. We know that you have a lot going on these days, and we really appreciate the fact that we're taking some time to learn about a really interesting and important topic today. So just a few more seconds and we'll get started with Faculty Focus. So good. Let's go ahead and begin. My name is Jeff Allum. I'm the AALS Faculty Focus moderator. I'm really happy to have everyone here today. This is our first series in our spring series of Faculty Focus, and we are really delighted with our topic and our two panelists. Today we're going to be talking about handling sensitive issues in the classroom. There's going to be a lot of ground to cover, but we think our two panelists are going to do a terrific job. The panel today is going to be moderated by our co-hosts, AALS President Vince Rougeot, who's the Dean of the Boston College Law School, and AALS past President Darby Dickerson, who's the Dean of the University of Illinois Chicago John Marshall Law School. As we kind of get ready for the series today, I just want to make sure that everyone knows the plan. Vince and Darby are both going to be giving some opening remarks, introducing our speakers, and then each of our two speakers are going to have about 15 minutes to offer some words of wisdom, some ideas, some suggestions on the topic. And then at the very end, we'll have some Q&A. So we really encourage everyone to please use the Q&A features and the chat features and engage with our panelists that way. Please know that this session will be recorded and it will be posted on the AALS website after a couple of days, so that anyone affiliated with an AALS member or fee-paid law school will have access to that. So please know of that. It's going to be a terrific session today. Really excited for that. And with that, I'm going to hand the ball over to Vince. Go ahead, Vince.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon for our Faculty Focus series, our first event of the spring semester. And on behalf of myself and Darby Dickerson, we're really pleased to be able to continue to moderate and host this series for you. One of the things that we aim to do at the AALS, an organization that provides professional support to faculty. And in particular, we designed the Faculty Focus series to be useful to early career faculty. Obviously, everyone's encouraged to participate, but we know, particularly since the pandemic began, that early career faculty have needs that sometimes are more difficult for their colleagues to meet because we are no longer in person in many of our schools. And once we began to do that, we realized that we could do a lot of great things for faculty in this format, and we can gather from around the country in really interesting ways and host some really great conversations, one of which you'll be hearing today. So thank you for joining us. And with that, I just want to pass the mic over to Darby for a few remarks as well.
Thanks, Vince. Welcome, everyone. It's great to be back for the spring season. We're excited about this topic. As your learning society, we want to be responsive to your needs. So although we have some great topics planned for you over the coming weeks, if you have ideas about things you want us to focus on, please send them along to me, to Vince, to Jeff, to any of the other AALS staff, so we can consider those and bring you topics that will help you with your teaching and scholarship. Back to you, Vince.
Thanks, Darby. So with that, let me introduce our distinguished presenters. First, we will be hearing from Susan Kuo, who's the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor of Law at the University of South Carolina School of Law. And she'll speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll be followed by Russell McLean, Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion and Law School Professor at the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law. As Jeff mentioned in the opening, we encourage you to use the chat and Q&A functions. As I said, each of our presenters will speak for about 15 minutes, and then Darby will lead with some questions and discussion. So with that, Susan, please begin.
Hi all. I want to thank our double ALS hosts, Jeff, Ginger, the deans, Judy Areen for inviting me to join today's panel, and Alexa and Jim for helping to make this happen. I'm grateful to be here with Russell and looking forward to learning from everyone in the room. So I'd like to discuss how we can create classroom environments that encourage interaction and dialogue among our students, even when discussing sensitive issues. So imagine yourself on the Death Star, right? Sitting around the table with Grand Admiral Tarkin, right, and Darth Vader. If you disagreed with Lord Vader, would you feel comfortable speaking out? Probably not. Right? You just be asking to be, what is it he does? Force choked, right, for your trouble. This is not the classroom culture we want to create. A key distinction, I'll argue, is the concept of psychological safety. Psychological safety is the belief that you can speak up, that you can take risks and share ideas, ask questions, discuss challenges without facing ridicule or retaliation, let alone the remote constriction of your ability to breathe. The term was developed in the organizational science literature more than 50 years ago. And since then, empirical research has demonstrated that psychological safety is an important component of a successful workplace because it's what allows employees to feel safe at work, right? So they can grow, they can learn, they can contribute and perform their tasks effectively. Effective leaders create psychological safety for their teams. And although this concept has been primarily studied in the context of the work environment, psychological safety is an essential condition for successful group collaboration and learning more broadly. And as such, the concept has obvious application to the law school classroom. Effective teachers create psychological safety for their students. Psychological safety is integral to fostering the willingness of students to take interpersonal risks and invest their energies into engaging in class. And this is especially important when discussing sensitive or polarizing topics, which can make students and faculty alike feel unsettled, exposed, or even targeted. As leaders of our classrooms, we should work to instill a sense of psychological safety. Now, some people misunderstand me as recommending that we be polite or seek to avoid conflict. But psychological safety isn't about being polite or conflict averse. It isn't about making students feel comfy in class or coddling them. And it isn't about transforming our classrooms into safe spaces or safer spaces, which, as Russell, my co-panelist, often notes, aren't necessarily conducive to individual growth and learning. In a recent New York Times article about psychological safety in the workplace, the reporter explained that when employees feel safe, they trust that they can admit mistakes. They trust they can seek feedback or even fail without dire consequences. As the reporter points out, not only does this lead to greater team success, but it can be life-saving, right? Case in point, when a nurse challenges a doctor's decision at a critical juncture. Putting this in an educational context, psychological safety is the belief that the classroom environment is safe for risk-taking. In a classroom with high psychological safety, students feel safe to take risks around their classmates and instructors. They feel confident that no one will embarrass or punish anyone for asking a question, making a mistake, or putting forth an idea. And I think with the rise of social media, most of us are pretty careful about how we portray ourselves publicly. And our students have long been steeped in these cautions from a tender age. And plus these days, I think most of us know that our class sessions are being recorded, if not by the school, by someone else in the classroom, right? Because almost everyone has a smartphone or they can record using their laptops. Or I just found out yesterday, even with these fancy little pens that record. So for this reason, if your students are afraid of appearing stupid, they're not going to ask questions. If they're afraid of appearing incompetent, they won't ask you for feedback. If they fear being labeled as rude or disrespectful or arrogant, they won't be critical, even constructively so. Right? They won't voice doubts. And if they're worried about appearing disruptive or annoying, they won't exhibit curiosity, right? They're not going to suggest anything innovative or thought-provoking. They'll just go along to get class over and done with. But if your students feel psychologically safe, they will engage. They'll engage with you, they'll engage with each other, because in a psychologically safe environment, you're given the benefit of the doubt by your classmates and your instructor, meaning that others will assume good faith on your part with respect to what you say and do, and that you'll do the same for them. So research clearly shows that in groups with psychological safety, members share more information with each other, they engage in moderate risk-taking, they learn more and more readily from group experiences, and they demonstrate greater creativity and problem solving. So how can we foster psychological safety? Well, studies show there are at least 3 behaviors we can engage in as instructors that will foster psychological safety in our classrooms. So behavior number 1, establish shared expectations and meaning. For example, clarify what your expectations are regarding your classroom and classroom engagement. Like, how will you define mistakes or failures with respect to achieving educational goals? I convey from the start that making mistakes is vital to learning, that I see my classroom and my teaching style as pro-learning, not pro-failure, because people automatically seek to avoid failure. Frame your role as the person whose job it is to help students individually and collectively achieve shared educational goals. In other words, let them know that you're no Darth Vader. Emphasize the importance of their contributions. People need to know that their efforts matter. So place your goals and their contributions in context. Seek input from them. Create an expectation of curiosity and sharing, and make clear what's at stake in any given situation. I constantly emphasize that asking questions, sharing a thought, right, that's a low stakes way to contribute to class and learn, right, along with others, and that the only thing on the line is their pride. Behavior number 2, create a culture of participation that welcomes all voices. So key actions here include proactive inquiry and situational humility. So be inclusive, right? Accessible, approachable, invite input, incorporate opportunities for students to provide feedback and follow up to get more information. And listen carefully and validate others verbally. Ask questions to create greater understanding, like, why do you think that? Can you provide an example? Ask questions to expand thinking, like, what are we missing? Right? Who has a different take on this issue? I often solicit feedback from students about their experiences as law students, and one recently shared this gem. When students perceive a professor to be approachable, human, kind, and genuine, they trust them. When students trust a professor, they inherently feel more included, valued, and engaged. Demonstrate humility. Believe it or not, students are intimidated by us. Legal education is a humbling process. Many students internalize their grades as a measure of their intellectual and self-worth, and we're the folks doling out the grades. So relax your own natural defense mechanisms. For example, it's okay if we don't have all the answers, because we don't. In fact, studies show that people actually gain confidence in leaders when they admit they don't know it all. I also advise you not to shy away from showing your own vulnerability. One way to encourage students to take risks is to demonstrate it in your own behavior. So in the New York Times article that I referred to earlier, a reporter interviewed an expert who runs a coaching and consulting business, and she said she could recall feeling safe to take risks just once in her 30-year career because her boss modeled vulnerability and welcomed ideas from all employees. That boss was Stacey Abrams. But circling back to the subject of our panel, don't let your fear of making mistakes, don't let your discomfort in broaching a sensitive issue stop you from addressing an important topic, or cause you to stop others, like your students, from addressing an important topic. And this is an issue that I have addressed again and again in various venues. But a way to encourage students to take risks is by demonstrating it in your own leadership. And if you're worried about mistakes, remember, you can fix them, or you can fix your mistakes. and you can fix those of others. I'm constantly fixing my mistakes, including my teaching errors. Plus, if you avoid discussing an obvious and sensitive issue, your students will notice. And your discomfort, your anxiety will become their discomfort and anxiety. They will wonder why you're ignoring the obvious. Maybe you don't care. Maybe you don't think it's a subject of concern for attorneys, and that will impact your class dynamics. And what's more, I guess what's even more troubling is that it may limit what your students to believe to fall within the compass of law. Behavior 3, respond productively to student contributions so as to foster learning. For example, express appreciation for well-intentioned input, regardless of whether it's good or bad. In particular, be aware of your facial expressions. I guess with masks on, you can't see, but certainly on video you can. Be aware of those facial expressions or other physical tells. I mean, do they convey negativity? Don't roll your eyes. Or I think relevant for online meetings, don't sigh loudly into your speaker. And that's a favorite of some of my colleagues during faculty meetings. Step in if you hear students talking negatively to or about other students. Make sure clear violations are addressed and people who repeatedly violate rules are held accountable. So to summarize, psychological safety is not the only ingredient necessary for successful group learning, but it is crucial for productive in-class discussions, especially on potentially sensitive issues. Okay? And the good news is that there are concrete steps we can take to create psychological safety, thereby expanding the range of topics that we can address constructively in our classrooms. And by doing so, we not only improve learning outcomes with respect to those specific topics, we also teach a broader civic lesson that I believe students carry with them. And that is how to engage others in discussions about issues that deeply divide us, how to combine our curiosity and compassion with conviction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. I thought I might ask you a quick question on the heels of this really thoughtful presentation. And that has to goes to what I'm sure some of our colleagues are feeling. We probably have many colleagues, particularly as more senior colleagues, who were trained to do some things that are actually directly opposed to some of the things that you were saying. I mean, in direct opposition, purposely making students feel uncomfortable, kind of breaking down their sense of security in an effort they believe to, prepare them to be better lawyers. Have you encountered that at all? And what would you say in terms of how to address that tendency amongst some of our colleagues?
I think frank discussions are the way to address this, because in truth, I've run into this time and again in my current position and with my more that old school teaching that I was raised on, right? And that is, you're wrong. Like I've never heard a more ridiculous answer. And that is a sure way to really shut particularly this generation down, right? And shut them down very quickly. Something that I also found interesting in that New York Times article that's relevant to your question is that the virtual environment that we're living in now has made it even more difficult to foster psychological safety. And this is because it's reduced the amount of social interactions that we have in general, right? That might soften the blow of some of these kind of harsh interactions in class. And according to one expert, when social interactions are hampered, the opportunities to build trust and truly connect, right? Those building blocks of psychological safety, they're reduced. And this is true for all group collaboration and learning experiences. But according to not just this article, but a number of studies, it's especially true for women engaging in these group collaboration and learning experiences. So I think it's imperative that we step up and educate one another, because just because we've done it forever doesn't mean that we've been doing it right.
Thank you. Russell, let me pass the mic to you.
Thank you so much, Vincent, and thank you, Darby, Jeff, Alexa, and AALS for inviting me to be a part of this session. And I'm so excited to be presenting with my friend Susan. So I'm really lucky. You all are lucky to have her as a presenter today. She's really thoughtful about these topics, and so every time I hear you, Susan, I learn something new. So thank you for that. I want to say that just at the outset, just to kind of tell you about myself, I feel like the webinar format is weird. I depend on seeing people's faces and reactions, and I don't get to see any of you. I gather from the participant list that there are 109 of you out there somewhere in the ether. So that's awesome. But I will tell you, I fashioned myself a closet comedian, and that makes life tough for me when I can't see faces. I mean, when I say a closet comedian, it means I neither write nor perform jokes, but I think I'm hilarious. And so I depend a great deal on seeing people laugh. So I got Susan, Vincent, Darby, and Jeff, whose faces I can see. I'll depend on them to laugh, and then the rest of you, I will just assume you think I'm hysterical. So thank you for that in advance. As we think about kind of sensitive topics and sensitive conversations, I have a few thoughts that I'd love to share with you. I think this is a wonderful topic to have selected for a webinar. So I want to start with something that Susan mentioned early in her comments. So we hear a lot about safe spaces, and for some reason I bristle at the term safe spaces, because to me it seems to indicate an absence of risk, right? A place where we can kind of be free from the risk that we might be harmed by something that is said. And so I want to propose to you a different kind of space where we can have these sensitive conversations, where we can take some risks. And so as any good law professor, I have come up with my own acronym, which I'll suggest to you. So instead of safe, I'm going to offer to you haven, Haven. My H is for humility. And this is just a recognition that none of us is perfect, that we are all at different places on our journeys, and that we can come to these kinds of conversations not expecting perfection from ourselves. My A is for authenticity. I might add in there transparency. And really it's about coming to these conversations as yourself, being yourself, not pretending to be something that you're not. And being willing to engage openly and authentically in that space. My V is for vulnerability. This is the kind of really specific, explicit acknowledgement of risk. If we ask other people to come to conversations and to be authentic and transparent, we risk hearing things that might upset us, that might bother us, that might hurt. And we have to be open to that. It's not a license to harm each other, but it is just a recognition that there is risk associated with having productive conversations on difficult topics. My E is for empathy, and that is really just recognizing that we all see the world through different lenses. We bring to these conversations our own set of life experiences that influence how we see the world. And so being open to seeing the world through other people's eyes can be a really helpful tool. And then finally, my N, because I was 4 letters to a really good 5-word acronym, I selected non-judgment. And here, I think it's really important to not only come and be humble and recognize our own imperfections, but to be non-judgmental and recognize that nobody else in this conversation is perfect either, right? And that if we don't expect perfection from ourselves, we shouldn't expect it from each other. So just being willing to create a space where there's a little bit of grace for everybody who's a part of the conversation, including ourselves. So as we think about sensitive conversations in the classroom, maybe I can just take a second to tell you what maybe you already know, but just where people are right now, how people are feeling right now. People are feeling extremely sensitive and raw. If we kind of go back just a year to or not even a year now, to the summer of 2020 and the killing of George Floyd and the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and the killing of Breonna Taylor. These are not new phenomena. They happen to be kind of visible to us because at least 2 of them were caught on video, and we, we see these snuff films kind of streamed online and on the news. But they're just kind of piling on, right? These decades, centuries of oppression kind of manifesting in these ways that continue to reopen old wounds, right? And so what I kind of would maybe like to just characterize here is that imagine, your students, your colleagues coming to these conversations already wounded, already hurting, and never having a complete opportunity for those wounds to heal, because there's always something else, right? We've had just within the last week murders in Georgia of people who are of Asian descent, and there's just people are coming to our learning spaces, students and others coming to our learning spaces, just desperate for comfort, right? Desperate for someone to understand who they are, to acknowledge that they matter, and to guide them, to lead them in these moments. And so I offer that to say that I don't think the conversation we have about this now is necessarily the same conversation we might have had 2 years ago. Maybe it should be the conversation that we had 2 years ago, but now I think that it's really important for us to really acknowledge where people are as they are entering into these conversations. So as we think about how sensitive issues come up in the classroom, I will just maybe throw out a handful of things that I imagine you could predict are primers for harm, things that might cause harm. This is not an exhaustive list, but just a handful of things that I could think of as I was preparing for today. Pronouncing names, right? A professor being able to say the name of a student and not butcher it for the entire semester. Doesn't mean you don't make mistakes, right? But it does mean that it matters enough to you to learn how to pronounce students' names correctly. And when you don't, it sends a signal that I don't matter, right? It sends a signal that I'm not important enough for you to be able to pronounce my name correctly. And whether you know it or not, I imagine you all do know it. We have many students who are already coming to our learning spaces, having anglicized their names because of that difficulty, right? Having already gone through, I don't know if it's trauma. I don't know that I can speak to that, right? But the difficult decision of selecting another name that is not one of their given names, just so that you, speaker who's interacting with them, can speak to them without harm. Another way that sensitive issues can come up is in the context of issues that are raised by some of the cases, right? We can expect in a range of con law cases, for example, or criminal procedure cases, that sensitive topics are going to come up. Those aren't surprises, but those can raise really important issues. And crim, this is, I know that crim professors think about this a good deal. Do I talk about sexual violence or gender violence or not, right? What choice do I make? Do I risk re-traumatizing someone who has been traumatized by this in the past, knowing the statistics on this and how prevalent that kind of harm is? Another side of that same coin is ignoring issues that are right there in the cases, right? So I teach contracts. I could choose to avoid issues of race, socioeconomic status, gender, and other disability and other topics. And if I do ignore them, right, that sends a signal that doesn't matter. And then, of course, we have insensitive remarks that can be made by professors, by students. Often these are unintentional statements, but they cause harm, and we can see that it happens. Or nowadays, when we're doing this on Zoom, we might see that we might not realize that something harmful has been said in a chat, but we discover it later, right? And so, again, thinking about how do we manage those kinds of situations. And then finally, I'll just throw out there what I will just call statistical minority status, right? That it is, as you come to learning spaces kind of already feeling harm, already having kind of experienced, in the case of a traditional law student, 22 something years of being a minority often and being and feeling marginalized, and you come into a law school and you feel further marginalized, right? I'm the only one in my room of of my identity group or groups. And so that can be an additional primer for students. And just in that terms of like statistical minorities, right, that can result in, be evidenced in other ways in lack of faculty diversity, right, lack of available role models, or in class you end up becoming the spokesperson for your group, where either people look to you to speak to issues affecting your group, or leave it to you to raise those issues, or they're not going to get raised. So what does this mean for students? And let me just start there and raise for you, if you're not familiar with the term stereotype threat. So I'm going to go into this really quickly. We could talk about it longer, but in really simple terms, stereotype threat is the fear of confirming a negative group stereotype. When you are a part of a negatively stereotyped group and you risk confirming a negative group stereotype, it can interfere with cognition and has been shown in educational spaces to have a measurable impact on academic performance, not just in standardized testing, where it's certainly been examined, but also in classroom experiences and in kind of overall semester-long grades. It might be worth kind of thinking about how this impacts students, and it really creates a level of anxiety, of worry about confirming the stereotype that can get in the way of your thinking. And so I'm going to do a weird webinar thing and ask you to close your eyes. So that's like half of what you've got right now in terms of interacting with me. I want you to close your eyes for just a second. I'd like you to imagine that you're driving a car. And if you're with me and I can't see you, so I'm just going to have to trust you, put your hands out on the wheel, be you. I want you to imagine that you're on a highway, driving down the highway. And you're cruising, you're in one of those kind of mindsets where you don't even remember the last 10 miles and suddenly you're at your exit, you don't know how you got there. One of those kind of drives. You're listening to the radio, you're thinking about maybe picking up groceries on the way home, or emails you have to return, or the presentation you're going to give the next day. And what I want to try to get across is that you're multitasking at this super high level. And I'm going to rush this a little bit, but I want you to kind of feel yourself in that space. And then I want you to tilt up your chin and just look in your rearview mirror for a second. And you see a police car pull behind you. No lights, just a car behind you. And I want you to, you can open your eyes now, and I just want you to think for a second about what happens in that moment, right? A second ago, a second before you looked in your mirror, you were multitasking. Your brain was operating at peak capacity. The second you saw that car pull behind you, you probably turned down the radio. You're certainly not thinking about your emails or groceries or the presentation. You are now hyper-focused on not doing something wrong, right? If you're savvy, you took your foot off the gas rather than stepping on the brake. That's another thing, right? But the fact is that this one environmental factor changing, that causes you to worry about what they're thinking, what they might observe, or what they might already have observed, interferes with your ability to think. You can only focus in this moment on the road, the mirror, and the speedometer, right? And gripping the steering wheel super tight. I don't think that's stereotype threat, but I do think that it has a way of mimicking how stereotype threat might be experienced. As Susan mentioned, everybody has this anxiety associated with being in class in law school. And what I want to suggest is that is exacerbated when you are a part of a minoritized group, a historically marginalized group. If I'm the only African American in the room, there's greater stakes to my raising an issue or my answering a question wrong in class, right? The stakes are greater for me, and that can end up actually fulfilling this negative prophecy about which I'm worried. So finally, I just want to offer a couple of thoughts about what this means for us as faculty, and then I really look forward to our discussion. As we think about creating spaces in our classrooms, I guess it's really important to think about who we are and what our roles are as educators, right? So in the spaces where I teach, right, I'm of course a teacher, right? I'm trying to convey information or adduce information from my students in order to help them learn, to help them master subject matter, to learn the art of analysis. Right? I think we actually serve a protective role when we teach as well, right? That we have committed ourselves to a profession where teaching and learning should take place. And if we allow some of these primers, some of these triggers to go unchecked, then what we do is really permit barriers to remain in place for our students who are the most vulnerable. And so finally, just in closing, what I would say is this: be willing to enter the waters when these moments arise. Some of them we can predict, sometimes they're unexpected. But I would resist the urge to be perfect. As law faculty, we know our own, I've taught professional responsibility for 13 years, right? I know it, I can teach it without looking at the book, like I know it really well, right? But when somebody said something that I didn't expect in class, right, about an issue that I wasn't planning on talking about, that can throw me. And it can sometimes cause us, I think, to freeze and to not take on those issues. But if we don't take those things on, if we don't, it doesn't mean we have to be confrontational, but if we don't at least acknowledge that something has happened in those moments, I think we risk further traumatizing, further harming our students. So I'm going to pause and say thank you again for letting me be a part of this, and I really look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Russell and Susan, thank you so much for those really wonderful remarks. And we've got a lot of questions coming in. So Susan, I'm going to direct the first question to you, and Russell, hop in if you want to add to the answer as well. But Susan, how do you help ensure psychological safety when students' comments may be used against them outside of class by other students who are their peers in the classroom?
Thanks, Darby, and thanks for this question. I think that I'm willing to bet that Russell can weigh in on this as well, but this is an opportunity for me to remind you that psychological safety exists at the class level, right? It exists at the team level. It doesn't exist at the organizational or institutional level, but at the culture of the institution. So this is important for our institutional leaders to know. The culture of the institution can contribute to that overall psychological safety that your students can hold. So I think it's incumbent upon us as instructors, right, to build those atmospheres, to build that culture, right, within our classrooms. And you can do this, you should do this on the very first day, if not sooner. Right? Whenever you have a way to touch and reach students, you need to build that culture, and you need to have some agreement on how you're going to move forth on or with respect to your disagreements. For example, I see that that Maggie's asked a question here about how do we create these community guidelines in the classroom? And this is where I'm going to pull from Jack Chin and his words of wisdom to me years and years ago about a good faith statement that I start with initially and immediately with all my classes, in particular in criminal procedure, where we talk about some tough issues. Very harsh consequences, disparate consequences for individuals, and very challenging issues of race and sex and violence, right? Race and gender. And one thing that I say, cribbing from the great Jack Chin, is that everyone needs to be free, right? Feel free to speak their minds respectfully, right? Informed, but without fear about the subject matter. And I ask that listeners assume good faith, right, with respect to comments that they don't agree with, because we're all professionals in this classroom. And I want everyone's thoughtful, reasoned, and candid views, even when you don't think everyone else will agree with you. And if you don't agree with something that's said, I want to hear that as well. Small statements like this, if you live that statement, right, you actually support it with your own behavior, can carry you a long way with your students. Case in point, one year I had a student who was talking about her experience in high school with drug dogs coming through the school regularly and sniffing at the lockers, sniffing at the cars in the parking lot. And this student is an African-American woman. And one of my white male students across the room was trying to support her story, but he kept referring to her as that gal over and over again. Like that gal says, like that gal says. And every time he said that, I responded with, you mean Counselor Washington? Oh, you mean Counselor Washington? Over and over. And for those who aren't aware, the term gal, right, has a very strong racial connection, racist connection in our history, especially here in South Carolina. And after that class, I had students come up to the podium and say to me, we're going to let you take care of this because we're going to assume good faith. on the part of our classmates. And then we hope to have a conversation with him or that you'll circle back with us. And I did. And that student was absolutely shocked, had no idea, thought he was using an timey, colloquial term that everybody would find warm, and fuzzy. And he immediately apologized. He didn't even have to have my encouragement, walked right over, found her and said, "I'm sorry, I just learned something very valuable." And everybody stood down. So to me, this is one way of building that culture in response to this question to make sure that these kinds of aggressions, micro or macro, don't happen outside the classroom. But it also makes it incumbent upon you to step up and intervene, again, when you hear students speaking negatively about one another or to one another.
Russell, the next question is for you, and here it is. Professor McLean mentioned asking ourselves how to handle insensitive remarks, often unintentional, that are made on a Zoom chat. How would he advise handling those comments? Do we take time in the next class to address those comments?
So I think that how you handle it depends on a number of contextual factors. So if you're watching the chat, and we handle these differently when we're teaching, but if you're the kind of person who's watching the chat while you're teaching, you may see it as it happens, right? And so for my own sake, what I would do is think about what are my goals in kind of dealing with this thing, right? So I may wish to educate people about it, and I may or may not be prepared to engage in that education in the moment. But as in my role as protector of the educational environment, I think that it is incumbent upon me to at least acknowledge that something was said so that people don't think that I saw it and didn't think that it was important, right? So I might actually say something like, I just saw something posted in the chat, like it concerns me, but I will say I don't feel adequately prepared to deal with it right now, but I don't want you to think that I don't care. What I plan to do is I need to think about this and kind of really think about what I want to say is I will come back next class and do this and maybe have a discussion at the beginning to deal with it. On the other hand, it may be that it's something that I feel like I can deal with in the moment, and I might just choose to do so. But I love Susan's observation about good faith. There are bad actors in the world, but I actually do think that much of what we see that we regard as harmful isn't intended to be harmful, right? I think that most of the people in our spaces wouldn't self-identify as racist or sexist or homophobes or kind of any of the other ists or phobes. But and particularly for these kind of, I'm old enough now, I guess I can say, these young kids, right? These 20 somethings, like many of them are getting to law school and for the first time seeing somebody who's different than they are, right? This is their first time really kind of opening their eyes to a world that is broader than their own experience. And so they have a lot of learning to do. And so I do believe that believing the best of people is a place to start, right? So I tend to approach these moments not with a voice of condemnation, but with a true desire to develop empathy and to protect and to acknowledge harms that might have occurred. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Russell. A couple of follow-ups for you. You also talked about not ignoring sensitive issues, but it almost seems like the answer you just gave was an answer to a question I had written down, is like, what if a sensitive issue, what if you missed a sensitive issue and someone else sees it and raises it when you're not expecting it, or it just comes out of left field, out of context? Do you suggest the same thing, that you just acknowledge that you're not prepared to address it in the moment, but we'll come back in the next class?
So again, I think it depends so much on context. It depends on what it is, right? If I'm teaching criminal procedure, like I can't be surprised that something comes up about, inequities in policing, right? Or in the carceral state generally. So those are things that I can anticipate. But it's, of course, always possible that something comes out of left field that I didn't expect. And I think that you do your best. This is where I really say resist the urge to be perfect, right? Because we may not handle it perfectly. And I think if we can be humble in those moments and say, like, I don't really know what to say about this, but it troubles me. Or there's a really important issue that, like, if I tried to address it in the 3 minutes that we have left in class, like, I'm going to do an inadequate job. So I'd much rather devote time, for the next class. I think it just depends. Some things may be important enough that it is worth scrapping, like, what you plan to do for that day, right, and focusing some attention on it. And so I don't think there's one right answer for how to handle those. But I think if you allow yourself the flexibility of handling it in a range of ways, and accept that you actually might not pick the right way, and be okay with that, but that you've tried and that you can learn from your mistakes without being defensive, I think that would help a lot.
Russell, you talked about N being non-judgment, and Susan, you talked about and addressed in the Q&A holding students accountable for their negative behaviors. And in that case, you did some things in the class, but a lot of it was handled privately. Where is the line where you might actually say something in the classroom in the moment? For example, if there's a racial slur or something that is having an impact on students in class.
Susan, you want to take it?
This actually makes me think of one of my many teaching errors. This one's actually in a book, so it's detailed in a teaching book. So it's humbling, but it's a good example of how you can make a comeback. And I guess the highlights are that teaching rape doctrine in criminal law makes me anxious, right? And the topic is triggering, and I worry about causing psychic damage, right, given the statistical likelihood that the class includes rape victims, perpetrators, alleged perpetrators, and the friends and family of all the above. So sometimes I'm not fast enough on my feet to respond. And this is an example of that. One semester I decided that avoidance was the best course of action. And so I rushed through the assigned readings and I launched right into the next set of readings on theft, thinking I just made it through unscathed because no one asked anything. But my students were not ready for that. And in the last seconds of class, I had a student raise their hand and ask if, and I'm going to rephrase some of the wording, but if a student rapes a sex worker, is that theft? And laughter just rippled across the classroom. And some of it because people were tense, right? And they were looking for something to kind of lower the tension in the room. And of course, I had a student, not surprisingly, responding very angrily and yelling, "You guys are so stupid." Right? And I stood there like a deer caught in headlights with my chin in the podium thinking, so I went back to my office and I fretted about my inability to cultivate an environment that was sensitive, right, to all these triggers. But I also thought about what I wanted the students to get from our coverage of this topic. And I didn't want the takeaway to be that rape was a subject of levity or entertainment. I wanted them to think, among other things, about how social norms have shaped the enforcement of rape law and vice versa. And ultimately, I decided I was going to put a question on the final exam, getting their perspectives on rape law reform and the element of non-consent. And I started the very next class session apologizing for my failure to respond, noting that I was taken by surprise. And I know that the comment had caused harm and distress. And then I spoke briefly about the importance of teaching as well as the challenges of teaching this subject. And I notified them of my plan to test them on this aspect of our study and to give them adequate time and reflection. I gave them the question. So they had the question like weeks in advance. And those are some of the best exam answers I've ever gotten. They were so thoughtful. And I walked away from that thinking, all right, I made something of the mess that I contributed to. So there are some times where you can respond in the moment, but that's an example of one, I didn't have time. The students were already grabbing their stuff and walking out. And second, even if I had time, I would have just stood there looking confused and lost. So sometimes it is okay, as Russell was saying, to say, I need to wait on this, but what just happened, is problematic. We're going to discuss this tomorrow, but let's move on. Right? And so that is a way of addressing it in the moment, but taking some time to think. And as a side note, I found that sometimes I respond to things wonderfully and I think, I'm on fire, I'm really on it. But really what happens is that I've been thinking about it so often, thinking about the possible things that could go wrong and things that could be said, that my responses seem reflexive, but what they are reflective, right, at that time.
A few years ago, I was presenting to a group of about 300 first-year students at an orientation, and one of the students, in reporting back on some small group work, unintentionally used the term colored people. I believe she meant to say people of color, right? But she used this, at best we would call it an outdated term, right? But clearly offensive term. I believed that she had made a mistake, which I think that's kind of where I start, right? Which is that someone doesn't intend to cause harm. But I also was aware that there were other people in the room who I could see on their faces were quite harmed by her use of that phrase. And so I let her finish her sentence, and then when she was complete, I just paused and took about 10 or 15 minutes out of what I was going to do, what I had kind of programmed, and said, we're about to have a tough conversation, and I'm not really prepared for it, but this is gonna be weird and hard for both of us, but I can't kind of let this kind of just happen. And I expressed to her that I don't think you meant to say this, but you said this, you may not even be aware of it. But if I don't say anything about it, I kind of become complicit, right? I want to perpetuate harm, and I'm a little worried about the people in the room whose hearts were broken as you said the word. And so I think that you can kind of confront in those moments without blaming, right? I think that, now, there's also the possibility that you have actors who are intentionally provocative, right? And so I think that you can, decide whether you want to believe the best or not. I still would be inclined to kind of at least hold myself out as someone who believes they're a good person who wasn't trying to be, a jerk, right? And if it escalates and maybe there's a kind of more direct and a harsher way to deal with it, I might just throw out that at some point. I imagine many of you are familiar with the relatively recent, it's a few years old now, changes in ABA Rule 8.4, added 8.4G, which is the first time that the ABA model rules of professional conduct have incorporated standards with respect to bias in the profession, in the legal profession. And I actually think that provides us an opportunity to engage with our students about professionalism, right? You can't use slurs in practice and get away with it right now. There are enforcement mechanisms that can actually affect your ability to practice law. And so these are standards that I actually think end up mattering. And it's a newer rule. There aren't a lot of cases, but there are some that I would share with students about how you can put your own ability to practice law in jeopardy if this is a lesson that you kind of don't learn, and use it as an opportunity to teach.
The next question, and I won't direct it to either of you, whoever would like to start can hop in. In the era of cancel culture and political correctness, should professors also need to be able to freely raise sensitive conversations?
So I am troubled by the notion of cancel culture for a number of reasons. I am troubled by the idea that we should decide whether other people can and can't say. But I'm also troubled by the idea that this term cancel culture appears to me now to be kind of used as a cudgel, right, to prevent those of us who are in educational spaces and elsewhere from insisting on civil behavior, right? And so I think this is a nuanced question, and we certainly don't have time, I don't think, to deal with it as effectively as I might prefer. But I suppose that I would say that we as professors, I think, should raise and sensitive questions. Doesn't mean we have to raise every sensitive question. I think we have to be mindful about how we do that. Do we do it in a way that causes more harm for people, right, or that minimizes the harm? Do we prepare a foundation before we wander into those areas that will allow the students to navigate those spaces effectively so that they're not traumatized? I think those are questions that we can ask ourselves. I'd be open if it, whoever posted the question, if you would like to follow up, I'm happy to follow up with you offline, just because I'm mindful of the time.
I was going to take advantage of this moment to read my favorite quote that I know Russell's heard a few times from one of my students, and I just love it. I oftentimes survey my students to get a sense of how they're interacting with us, right, in plural, in the classroom. And this is an excerpt from one of my students describing the discomfort that students will feel about sensitive topics, and also why they believe some topics should be addressed head on. So here's the quote. Many students seem to only conceive of racism, for example, as interpersonal, purposeful, and overt. So discussing it in the context of a case feels like an indictment, as well as a distraction from the legal concept. Therefore, people get defensive about these issues and tend to treat them as off topic, right, outside of a civil rights course or a constitutional law course more broadly. But I think the collective disdain for comments invoking identity or justice is outsized and reflects a deeper discomfort with the subject beyond its taking up class time. And I think we use this as a defense mechanism to avoid engaging with the consequences of the law and the power we wield over people's lives in ways that are harmful. I fear this limits our ability to think critically about the law and engage with the consequences of our future practice. So I think the solution to this falls in the hands of professors. The greatest way to lend credence to the relevance of these issues is to include them in class discussions in the same way one discusses any other legal concept. The best way to dispel the notion that talking about identity or injustice in the law is off topic is to make it a topic.
Thank you, Susan.
Can I just throw in and that was amazing. I think it's a real thing. I don't know if everybody here will agree with me on this, but I actually think it's a real thing as we kind of think about the notion of liberalism in our profession, right? And I worry, like as somebody who's not particularly conservative, but I worry that we kind of have gotten to a point in our society, I suppose, generally, that we just can't see that reasonable people can hold ideas that are different from our own, right? We kind of can't accept the idea that people can be, educated and informed and think any differently than we do on certain topics. And I think that that's a risk. I think we risk silencing conservative voices in the academy, even though they may hold ideas with which we disagree. I think we owe it to our educational dialogue to be able to tolerate and manage discussions, civil discussions, with logic and reason and civility. So thanks.
I think this is likely to be the final question. I teach on very sensitive topics related to identity. I'm regularly tested on how woke I am on the issues. How do you recommend I and others in my position respond to what are sometimes open challenges?
So I would start out on the first day of class, kind of acknowledging that I may not be the wokest person in the room, right? And just try to resist like the notion of judgment about how woke I am. That's I'm on a journey, you're on a journey, and you may be ahead of me on this particular path, and I'm okay with that. I have some things that I can teach you, and you surely have some things that you can teach me, and I'm delighted if you have things to share with me that I don't yet know.
I agree. Be genuine. Be yourself, because no one else can be you, but also students will pick up if you're making something up. Right? Just be honest with them. I think they appreciate that more than trying to be something that you're not.
Well, thank you both. And I'm going to turn the program over to Vince to close us out.
Thank you, Darby. And let me offer my deep gratitude to our presenters, Professor Russell McLean and Professor Susan Kuo. This was an extraordinary conversation. We are in a time period culturally, politically, economically in our country right now that is really challenging, and it affects everything that we do as legal educators. And the topics we address today are particularly important as part of that complex web of issues. So I know I learned a lot from the conversation we had today, and I plan to bring some of this back to my teaching, and I know all of our attendees did as well. Before we break, I want to remind everyone of our next Faculty Focus program, which will be on April 6th. from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. It will be on drafting and grading exams and providing meaningful feedback. We'll be talking about things like creating effective exams, grading them fairly and in a timely manner, and providing meaningful feedback in a way that involves both art and science, among other things. But as we think about the issues we're dealing with today, that's another issue that requires a lot of sensitive attention too. So I look forward to joining you again on April 6th. And on behalf of all of us here at the AALS, thank you for joining us.